Dr. Phil Roberts is widely recognized as Wyoming's premier historian. If you want to know something about Wyoming, Phil is not just a first resource, but often the last one needed. Because his services as a public speaker are in high demand, he averages about 50 talks a year to community groups and academic organizations in Wyoming, the region, and the nation. Phil is a Wyoming native, growing up in Lusk, Thermopolis, and Torrington before graduating from Cody High School. He started his undergraduate education at Northwest College in Powell, and then transferred to UW, where he graduated in 1973. He earned his PhD from the other UW, the University of Washington, in 1990. And along the way, he did a tour of duty in the Marines and earned a law degree from UW's law school. Phil authors the Wyoming Almanac with his two brothers, now in its 6th edition, and his textbook, Readings in Wyoming History, is now in its 4th edition. His book on the Shoshone Cavern National Monument has recently been published. Phil's interests range broadly. He's written articles on topics like a hospital in Hot Springs, the politics of locating veterans facilities in Wyoming. All Americans are hero worshipers, American observations on the first U.S. visit by a reigning monarch in 1876. Wyoming as community, and of course that happy topic, the history of the Wyoming sales tax. With that, let me welcome Phil to speak to us today on how did Shoshone Cavern become just another hole in the ground. Phil.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a distinct honor for me to be able to stand before you here some, well, let's see, a half century and a little more since the time I graduated from the building that used to be there, at least, before it was surrounded in a cocoon-like fashion over here at Cody High School. So it's nice to be back, and it's nice to be able to talk about an area that, or a part of the local community that many of you know a good deal about, but I'm hoping that I'll have at least a few things that will enlighten you further about the Shoshone Cavern National Monument that later became Spirit Mountain Cavern that has had a long and interesting history here. I want to thank Paul again and Shannon and Jeremy and Bruce and all the folks who have made this visit a very pleasant and memorable. So thanks very much to all of them. This is there it is. The title is a little bit provocative, but what I'm trying to get across in the title is that we had a very interesting situation in this area, in that we're one of the very few places in the United States where there was a national monument declared, and then it was delisted. And so what I'm going to do is talk about some of the early problems that went into trying to make it a national monument that would be able to attract attention to the area here and get people to climb up 3/4 of the way up Cedar Mountain to get to the entrance of a cave. And when I say climb, I mean it was about a 3-hour walk from the end of a rather primitive trail to sort of sagebrush it on the way up to get to that the mouth of that cavern. This particular photo I'll be addressing a little later, but one important character in this particular photograph, you thought I was going to say Buffalo Bill, didn't you? One important character is the character that's barely seen on the left, and that's the dog. The dog that belonged to Ned Frost, who was the dog that discovered the cavern. And Jeremy Johnston says that it was actually a golf dog that was that was given to Frost, and so therefore there's a Johnny Goff connection to this as well. So that I'll have to put that in a footnote later. Well, Cody was a pretty small and treeless place in 1909 when a lot of the initial action went on concerning the story that I'm about to tell. There were a number of people who were already affiliated with tourism and with providing hunting guides and hunting experiences for people up here in the Cody country. And one of these individuals was Ned Frost. He's pictured here with his business partner, Fred Richard. And Ned Frost is pictured on the left. And the whole story of Shoshone Cavern started with Ned Frost. Here he is again with one of his hunting parties up on the North Fork. It started when, on a cold January day in 1909, he and his pack of dogs were looking around for some pelts, because usually business was pretty slow in the wintertime, and people who were in the guiding business in those days would make a little bit of extra income by trapping bobcats or running down mountain lions or whatever else that might appear. And so he was up on the side of Cedar Mountain, and one of the dogs took off from the rest of the pack and went running toward a bobcat that was just about to go under what Ned Frost thought was a ledge. And he said, as he was watching, this bobcat suddenly was about to be caught by one of the dogs, and the bobcat disappeared into the side of the ledge. And he got to looking, and the dog followed the bobcat into that ledge, and it turned out that ledge was the mouth of a cave. Well, there's the dog again with the arrow pointing down, and I've even put him in a frame here. So there is the dog then. Here is Ned Frost then on the side of Cedar Mountain, and wondering what it is that is in this particular depression in the ground about 3/4 of the way up the side of Cedar Mountain. And so he had some matches with him, and so he set out trying to follow the dog down into this cavern. And as he told the story years later, after he ran out of matches, he decided that he better look around and make sure he could see the mouth of that, because he was going deeper and deeper and deeper down into the ground and further away from the entrance. Well, that very same week that Ned Frost was exploring what he had found as a result of his dog chasing the bobcat into this hole, there was another important thing going on down in Cheyenne with State Representative C.E. Hayden and this guy here, Jake Schwab, who was in the state Senate. And they were introducing a bill in their respective houses of the legislature to create Park County. So here is Schwab with license number 1 on his car that he retained his entire life, thanks to the fact that he had sponsored the bill to create the Wyoming Highway Department, and therefore they recognized him with license plate number 11. Now see, that's what I'm not supposed to do, is get off track. That's what Paul has told me. Stick with the story. Don't go off on these tangents. So that's the last tangent. Okay, now back to the story. After some discussions with people down in Cody, Ned Frost got a group of people together to go up and take some measurements and figure out just what was up there. And these are not the figures that they originally came up with, but over the next couple of decades, it was determined that the cave had measured about 4,400 feet in length. There are hundreds of rooms, and as this says here, the cave descends below the Shoshone River, and indeed some researchers believe that it goes under the Shoshone River and then back up into Rattlesnake and continues then as various small caves and small passageways into the base of Rattlesnake Mountain to the north. And I don't know if there's been any additional geological evidence of where those go or not, but it would certainly not be surprising because the cave or the entire Cedar Mountain is pretty much honeycombed with these passageways. Here are some photographs that were taken early on by Fay Hiscock, the famous Cody photographer, who was the photographer, in fact, of the Buffalo Bill Party with the dog, that first slide. But he went down in and shot some interior photographs, and they're a little bit difficult to see because the lighting is obviously non-existent under there, and he was using very primitive lighting, very primitive photography to take these shots. But I think they're pretty phenomenal for being taken in those early years of photography. The cave almost immediately became a site that everybody in Cody needed to take a look at. And one person who saw it as a very important potential attraction is, of course, our man, William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill. One aspect of this, making it very important, is that Cody not only saw this as a great tourist attraction, but he also had friends in some pretty high places. And one of these friends in a very high place was none other than President William Howard Taft. Taft had moved into the presidency 2 months after the discovery of the cavern. After all, Buffalo Bill's old friend Theodore Roosevelt had been president at that time, but Taft followed Theodore Roosevelt into the White House, and within months of the discovery of the cavern, in the very year that the cavern was discovered, in fact, it was William Howard Taft who, under the terms of the Antiquities Act, used his authority as president to designate Shoshone Cavern as Wyoming's second national monument. It was immediately put under the administrative control of Yellowstone National Park, and here is a map that accompanied the legislative act showing the land area that had been set aside for the cavern and for the surrounding areas. The national monument boundary was listed right with the nomination. Now, of course, the Antiquities Act gives to the president extensive authority to designate archaeological, scientific, historical landmarks, things that may come into danger if they're not designated right away. The kinds of places that could get looted, could be destroyed, and the theory behind the Antiquities Act was to allow the president to act on it quickly and not have to go through acts of Congress as these sites were known and as these sites were potentially the targets of all kinds of potential looting or vandalism. The Antiquities Act did have some limitations, still has limitations with respect to land area, and a lot of that's under constant litigation, but I'm not here to talk about that part today. So suffice it to say that Theodore Roosevelt, pictured here in the top hat with his later chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, were both very instrumental in seeing that the president be given this kind of authority, largely through the support of the archaeological community, because the archaeological community had discovered that down in the Southwest in particular, once an archaeological site was discovered, within days sometimes, people would hear about it and decide to loot the pots or the baskets or the things that were there. And by the time the federal government or whatever governmental authority was involved would be able to protect that area, a lot of the stuff would be gone. And so the very first site in the nation to be set aside as a national monument was not exactly a site where there were buried baskets or pots. We all know this site, of course, because it's Devil's Tower. And in actuality, if you look at the terms of the Antiquities Act, on first blush, it doesn't make sense that Theodore Roosevelt would set aside Devil's Tower in this particular way. But what was going on up in Devil's Tower area at that time was that there were a number of people who were trying to homestead the land on which Devil's Tower was located. And if an individual had been allowed to homestead on that particular site, the community around Devil's Tower would have been very upset because it had become a gathering place for picnics and for holidays for a number of years by surrounding ranch communities. And so it was the ranch communities in the general area of Devil's Tower who urged President Roosevelt to utilize his powers under the Antiquities Act to protect Devil's Tower. And here is an example of one of those celebrations back in 1893, quite a few years, 14 years before the park was, or before the site was designated the first national monument, of demonstrating how the local community celebrated at that site. So here is, again, a lot of popular support for this monument to be set aside. And on top of that, Wyoming's congressional delegation was very favorable to setting aside Devil's Tower, protecting that resource from possible homesteaders and individuals who would try to profit on it and keep the local people from continuing their tradition of having picnics and community events held at the site. I'm not going to go into the Antiquities Act. That's not what I'm here for. Aren't you glad? But in many respects, when you're looking at these national monuments as they were forming, there are a couple of things that might explain why the Antiquities Act is quite important and why national monuments are quite important. And so I've pretty much summarized two ways of looking at these national monuments in these two statements. That in point of fact, a society does have long-term cultural values. And it may be to the benefit of the society broadly to bestow upon government the responsibility of safeguarding those cultural values, at least those ones that are in physical form. And one way to do that, of course, is to watch after these important national monuments, these places that we all enjoy as a cultural value for our society. But on the other hand, there are others who would argue that, wait a minute, just because a national monument expresses the cultural values of one time period, should that obligate future generations to continue to preserve and protect that national monument, that thing that had cultural value for that particular society and era that put it under protection? And that's really what's going on here with Shoshone Cavern National Monument being designated the second national monument in Wyoming, and then becoming the first national monument in Wyoming to lose its status as a national monument. So there may be a change in cultural values. We'll use that as one possibility as to why this change occurred over a period of actually a little less than a half century. Well, the first decade of the existence of the cavern as a national monument illustrates some of the real issues that were going to plague the monument for its entire existence. And that is, even though Buffalo Bill was a big promoter of the site, and even though Ned Frost had found it, there was not the level of political support present for watching after this monument like there was with Devil's Tower. And of course, one reason might be obvious, and that is you can see Devil's Tower. You can't always see a hole in the ground, right? A cave, that's a little different. And again, that reflects also some differences in how our society views monuments, because if we see one, Devil's Tower sort of looks like what you'd expect a monument to look like. It's up in the air, it's above ground. Well, there's not a lot of people, probably all of you, but most other people, there are a number that don't like caves. And I know you all are spelunkers from way back, and so you love caves, but there, believe it or not, are people that don't particularly like to go down into caves. And so there's another problem with Shoshone Cavern early on. The National Park Service took control over the Shoshone Cavern soon after the Park Service was established in 1916. But you would expect that the National Park Service would be extremely sensitive to the protection of this site, because after all, it was handed to them from the management of Yellowstone when the National Park Service was formed. It, in theory, was a subset of the administration of Yellowstone National Park. But as it turned out, the monument wasn't of particular interest to a couple of generations of National Park Service people. And you'd say, well, wait a minute, aren't they the organization that's charged with protecting this national monument? Well, in many cases, because Congress had no particular incentive to support any improvements to the site, and the Park Service had very little resources anyway to do what they thought was the extremely important task, which it indeed was, to protect Yellowstone Park and all the things in Yellowstone. Because of that, Shoshone Caverns was neglected by the Park Service. They, in essence, sort of passed it off as saying, well, when we get lots and lots of money someday, then we'll be able to do this. And of course, you get lots and lots of money someday, and you have all these other priorities in Yellowstone that you're going to have to get accomplished, because the Park Service, of course, has this dual responsibility of protecting the resource and then making it comfortable for travelers. And trying to balance those two obligations were pretty tough, as it was in a time in which there wasn't a lot of federal money to be applied to all of these areas that the Park Service was responsible for. So here is this cave on the side of a mountain. What are we going to do with it? Well, maybe someday we'll be able to do something with it, but we can't do it now, is more or less the attitude of the Park Service during the 20s. Well, Horace Albright was able, and he was the assistant director of the National Park Service, and then of course the head of the Park Service in Yellowstone. He offered to spend $700 to upgrade the site, mainly to make the site safe to visit. And when he says safe to visit, he means not necessarily down in the ground, but safe to get to, because you've got such a steep ascent to get to the top. That 3 hours of walking up to the top is pretty difficult. And by about 1920, you could take a horse partially up that way and then walk the rest. So it got it down to about 2 hours to get from the base up to the mouth of the cavern. One thing that really bugged Horace Albright and bugged the Park Service was that the Cody residents started referring to it as Frost Cave. Not because there's frost up there. We all knew that wasn't the reason. The reason was to honor the guy whose dog had found it. They couldn't very well call it, I don't know if the dog's name was Fido. I don't remember what the dog's name. But rather than call it Fido Cave or whatever, they named it, of course, for Ned Frost. And the Park Service said, well, that's deceptive. If you tell people it's Frost Cave, they're going to expect that they're going to go up there and they're going to find a frosty, icy cave, and that's not the case. And of course, the next alternative that the Park Service suggested was Crystal Cave, and that was okay. But what the Park Service really opted for was Shoshone Cave or Shoshone Cavern, because it identified it very closely with the nearby river. And by then, the nearby river, of course, name had been changed some 17 years earlier from the Stinking Water River to the Shoshone. And you all know the Wyoming legislature did us that favor to rename our river something a little less colorful than or odoriferous as Stinking Water, which it originally had been named by John Colder back in the early part of the 19th century. Well, there were awful access limitations because it was on a high rocky ridge. And the question was, how are you going to get around the access problem? How are you going to be able to get people up there? It's a 3-hour walk. You can work on improving the road. But in essence, it was a pretty arduous job to get up to the caverns. And if there's anything that the people who were involved with the caverns recognized, was that this particular site was on the Cody Road to Yellowstone, and a lot of people were anxious to get to Yellowstone, and so you'd have to make it pretty comfortable and pretty easy for them to be able to take a detour to go up to the top of a nearby mountain near Cody and spend a half a day or so exploring a cave. So that was always first and foremost on the minds of promoters of the caverns, is that we've got to capture a portion of the traffic and get the portion of the traffic who might be not necessarily spelunkers but really interested in caves, to get them to journey up to the caverns, then presumably come back, spend an extra night in Cody, and head off for Yellowstone the next day. Well, there is also the access problem inside the cave, because as you go through the entrance, you get to a couple of places where there are really steep drop-offs. And clearly there had to be some sort of a rope ladder or wooden steps or something constructed in order to be able to facilitate your usual tourist. You didn't want just to have the expert rock climbers going down into the cavern. You wanted to have the general public. And so it wasn't until the 1950s that wooden steps were installed. This is by the contractor Claude Brown in the 50s. But the Park Service did spring for some rope ladders, and I don't know if there was instructions at the bottom, watch your step because you might fall off of here. I know there was nothing on the sign that said hard hats required after this point. I know that wasn't there. So you're basically on your own once you got to those rope ladders, and you could go up and down the rope ladders and get fairly far into the cavern. Well, there was a lot of publicity generated by the caverns in the early years, but unfortunately it wasn't the kind of publicity that was very helpful to your usual traveler. And this publicity often happened in the form of people getting lost down inside the cavern. They'd get down in there and they would run out of matches, or their lantern would blow out and they wouldn't be able to figure out how to get out again. And so throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, these stories somehow captured the public imagination, where here is a tourist that stops by and innocently walks up to this cavern and then walks into this cavern, and then they become lost for days down in the ground. And oh my, what a incredible story this is. And of course, it did get lots of publicity nationwide, but not the kind that the promoters of the caverns were very, very pleased to have. Well, along came the New Deal, and one particular organization, the Civilian Works Administration, the CWA, was established. There were needs for several hundred jobs for Cody area people who were unemployed as a result of the Depression. And one project that was promoted by the local people for the CWA was to do something about access up the side of the hill to the cavern. But as it turned out, the organization that you would expect would be promoting that, the National Park Service, they had other priorities, and they wanted the CWA to be working on the Cody Road to Yellowstone, to be working on various comfort features within the park that would help with the tourist experience in Yellowstone. And they were not at all helpful or even sympathetic to utilizing federal money to hire relief workers to build the road up the side of Cedar Mountain. And so it took local promotional efforts on the part of the Cody Club, and it was to the benefit of the site and also to the benefit of the Cody Club that one of their membership, Paul Grieger, had been elected to Congress, a Democrat from Park County. Yes, they did exist at one time. And he was elected to Congress, and he saw fit to help influence the CWA administrators to authorize something beyond the work that the CWA was doing. By the way, they were doing also things in town, like working on roads around Cody and working on the park and building some public structures, restrooms and stuff at the park. So they were doing a lot of things, but Grieger pressed the New Deal to support the cave, but also at the same time he too was willing to help the Park Service in their main effort, which was to and help Cody, of course, too, to provide year-round access to Yellowstone via Sylvan Pass. So this became more or less a package that the CWA was going to be working on. But again, the Park Service lacked interest. Here I list two things here that the National Park Service officials were quoted as saying during the period of the 30s up until 1953. One very common statement was that the site was locally significant only. There was one Park Service director who said, well, we have room for one example of a cave in our system. And we have all kinds of caves in the system, and this is just one. We have Carlsbad Caverns. We have caves in South Dakota. We have caves all over the place, and this is just one. So why should the Park Service be responsible for keeping an example of more than just one cave? Like, okay, we pick a specimen like a zoo, and we select one specimen for representing that particular species in the zoo, and the species of a cave is not representative, or the Shoshone Caverns is not representative sufficiently of the species of a cave, and therefore we ought not to take care of it. Well, that was the attitude. There were a lot of, quote, better examples of caves, as the Park Service people pointed out. And I'm a little rough on them here, but in the book I'm a little more generous, because the Park Service did indeed suffer from any number of severe financial difficulties at the time. And so in essence, it was simply a case of priority setting, and it turned out that the people who were in charge of the Park Service were not particularly interested in going deep in the ground into caves either. So that was a little low on their priority list. Well, one of the Park Service employees even went so far as to write to the member of Congress, Paul Grieger from Cody, and he suggested that since the Park Service really didn't have the money to take care of this cave, why couldn't Representative Grieger just get a measure introduced into Congress to turn the cave back over, I shouldn't say back over, but over to the City of Cody, and even if the City of Cody didn't want to take it on as their city park, up there 5 miles as a crow flies from where we are right at this moment, then maybe the Cody Club would have an interest in it, because he knew that Grieger had been an officer for a couple of terms as president of the Cody Club. And so here is again the Park Service actually making the recommendation that a national monument be delisted. So it seems like a rather strange contradiction. Well, here is the successor to Toll, because he was killed in an auto accident as he was trying to set up Big Bend National Park down in Texas in 1935. But the Park Service decided that they would send some people out to investigate what could be done to make the monument presentable, you might say, so that they could transfer it to some other agency and get it off their backs. And so from 1937, for the next 5 years, there was nothing much done except for a few random reports by visiting park rangers from Yellowstone who would go down and take a look and see how things were looking inside the caverns. Well, it reached a point where the Park Service had so lost touch with what the caverns were all about that I even found among the correspondence in the National Archives a note from a press person from the National Park Service who wrote to the superintendent of Yellowstone and asked the question, "What is Shoshone Caverns?" That's like an employee in Washington asking their man back here in Wyoming what this national monument is. You would expect they would find it somewhere on their database. That sounds computerese. I think that's anachronistic. I take that back. In their file cabinet someplace. But the caverns were so neglected that, as I note here, a person wrote to Washington, D.C. asking for information about Shoshone Caverns, and the clerk said, "Oh, I would be very happy to send you the information we have on Shoshone Canyon," not recognizing that was, in fact, the question was about Shoshone Caverns. Well, here are all these agencies fighting it off, trying to decide whether or not the caverns were causing troubles with some of their resources nearby, the Forest Service being one, the Bureau of Reclamation being the other. And of course, the Bureau of Reclamation feared that the caverns would impact irrigation projects. The Park Service worried about the spillways that might cause the lower levels of the caverns to fill with water, and there would be some sort of liability there. But about the same time that the caverns had been found, we had the completion of what's now the Buffalo Bill Dam, which was the Shoshone Dam. And of course, there was absolutely no positive interest on the part of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to do anything about maintaining the cavern, because this, to them, might be a possible hazard to the spillway, might be a possible hazard even to the reservoir. They weren't sure, but they were certainly not in favor of developing that site very far. But the problem was that in the Antiquities Act, there is no provision or procedure to delist a national monument. How do you have one and then get rid of it? There's nothing in the Act that provides any guidance at all on what one ought to do. Of course, about 1943 until 1953, the Jackson Hole National Monument question was answered by transferring what had been declared to be a national monument by Franklin Roosevelt with the Rockefeller gift in 1943 to pretty much do away with that national monument by merging it into Grand Teton National Park. And as we all know, that's what led to Congress declaring that the Antiquities Act and the authority of the president to unilaterally declare a national monument works in 49 states, but is null and void in Wyoming. In Wyoming, the president has to go to Congress to get a national monument established. It's the only state that's set aside in the Antiquities Act as not allowing for any kind of presidential unilateral action to proclaim a national monument within the boundaries of our state. And the only national monument that's been established since this point was Fossil Butte. And Fossil Butte had to go through both houses of Congress with the support of the presidential administration in order to get confirmed as a national monument. Well, delisting, for whatever it was worth, was possible in 1950 because the Park Service was ready and willing to turn it over to the City of Cody or whoever wanted it. But the possible takers all said, well, we will do it, but you have to finish the road that wasn't finished by the CWA. Well, then there was a property title issue because somebody said, well, the road that leads up to the base of Cedar Mountain is trespassing on my land, and so they had to deal with that. And then finally, the Bureau of Reclamation started questioning whether or not the land transfer would affect some properties that were part of the Reclamation Bureau's responsibility. But finally, by the 1950s, all the elements were in place for withdrawing monument status. One, and very significantly, the Park Service wanted to get rid of it. Two, there was some national defense potential because in 1946, the federal government, the War Department thought, well, maybe this would be a good place to build what later went into Cheyenne Mountain down at Colorado Springs. Maybe we could have the NORAD headquarters in Shoshone Caverns. Wouldn't that have been quite a sight, having the available air base that would service that would be a little hard to find in this vicinity. But who knows, we could have had, I don't know what, maybe the site of Heart Mountain would become an Air Force base, or I don't know what they would have had in mind, but that didn't last very long because there were members of the upper brass of the Defense Department, the Air Force, the about to be newly created Air Force, who said, no, we don't want it there, we want it somewhere else. The Cody Club was continuing to lobby and saying that we can take care of it. Give it back to us. The mayor and the council decided that indeed the city of Cody could swing it as a city park. And of course, preservationists were split over the question. And finally, both members of Congress, Senator Lester Hunt, Democrat, Senator Frank Barrett, Republican, agreed to co-sponsor a bill that would turn over the park, would first delist it and turn over the park to the city of Cody, which they did, final passage in 1953. There was an important provision that was added on to it. The president signed the bill, and Governor-elect Millward Simpson was very happy with the result because, after all, Cody was his hometown. But everybody knew that the city had to take some prompt action to do something about the cavern because there was language slipped in there that if Cody didn't take care of it, and if they ignored it for 10 years, then the site would revert back to the federal government. So private investors get interested. Local businessman Claude Brown decides to take a 20-year concession contract to try to make that facility serviceable. He does all kinds of work on the inside of the cavern to make it possible for people to walk around in there. But frankly, he has very little financial backing to do it. He wants a name change from Shoshone Cavern, of course, to get away from the idea it was a national monument. So it gets renamed Spirit Mountain Caverns. And it's sort of a condition at the time where if there is a Native American connection to be made, there was the idea that maybe it would encourage more tourism. Well, as the caverns progressed, one idea that Claude Brown's backers and his corporation came up with was to take an aerial tramway and build it to the top, or to the site. And there were some people who said, well, wouldn't this be great to honor Buffalo Bill, because you could take the aerial tramway all the way to the top where his grave supposedly should have been, and one of the stopping spots on the way back or on the way up could be Shoshone Cavern. What a great deal, an aerial tramway to the top of Cedar Mountain. But alas, there was very little money to even do the very minimum to take care of the road, make it the road passable and the interior passable. So finally, they do get the inside passable. Some people, I don't know if anybody, there's nobody here that's old enough to have been in there when it was under contract from, is there anybody old enough who? Oh, okay. Well, it was only 20 years ago though, wasn't it? So, okay. Well, there was a big dedication ceremony, and a whole lot of people showed up on the 15th of September of 1957 as the grand opening of the caverns took place. There were lots of people there, including Ned Frost, pictured here as the elderly man out in the sort of the front, about the fourth person from the right, Millward Simpson on the far right there. And all kinds of tours got recorded for the newspapers around the region. The Park Service made these accessible because even though it was turned over to the City of Cody, the Park Service did offer to help with some of the promotion, or at least the literature so states. And the cave discoverer, Ned Frost, was an honored guest. Whoop, his picture was supposed to be there. Okay, well, sorry, Allie, I didn't have that picture in there. Our videographer's tracking this. But here is everybody happy, but the problem is that Claude Brown's not able to attract visitation to really even keep the electric lights going that he had constructed up to the cavern so that there could be electric lighting within. And so in 1966, he turned the lease back over to the City of Cody, more or less admitting defeat, that he wasn't able to turn it into a paying proposition to take care of those problems of access internally and externally. So the federal government finally, very quietly, in 1976, in the form of the BLM, notified the Cody City Council that they were going to exercise the option for the reversion because there was no evidence that the City of Cody had done anything with the cave for a period of 10 years. And the mayor and city council of Cody was in ready agreement with that because they did not have the resources to expend on the caverns. The City of Cody was growing. There were lots of needs down here on the ground, and the city responsibilities, at least in the view of that mayor and council, certainly didn't contemplate taking care of a state park or a city park 5 miles from downtown Cody. So what's the current state of the caverns? Well, it's administered by the BLM. Some of you might have been up there. I see my time has expired. So in essence, the question is, did cultural values change? Is this what caused the park to be, or the monument to be established and then delisted? I would say that probably politics had a lot to do with it. Maybe not cultural values as much as just the financial and political scene. The money wasn't there and the political will wasn't there to make this a going proposition. There were budget priorities. There was a philosophy of government that Frank Barrett had articulated. There was a partisan advantage that U.S. Representative Keith Thompson articulated, and then the popular support locally. All of those interests coincided to eliminating the national monument and, in essence, allowing for that national monument to revert back from city ownership into the hands of the federal government. So my time's expired. How about that? Thank you. And I'll be able to answer some questions that are.
Well, we have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Oh, okay. About 2 questions. There's one over here.
I'd like to know if there was any evidence at all for Native American involvement in the cavern, because the name was changed to Spirit Mountain Caverns. Is there any archaeological evidence?
There was archaeological evidence of Indian teepee, not teepee rings, fire pits at the front of the entrance. But nobody was able to definitively find any evidence of Native people going down into the caverns. There are all kinds of animal bones down in there, and it was certainly a place where bobcats and mountain lions frequented. And there are lots of bats down there, and there's also poison gas down at the bottom. But there is no archaeological evidence that I was able to discover through my reading anyway.
Any legends or
Well, again, it's more or less the fact that there were Native people at least encamped nearby that would suggest that there may be something significant that they held some significance to that cavern, but
that might have been the angle that would have saved the caverns, or might still save the caverns.
Mm-hmm. I think in retrospect that's exactly right. I think if there had been something archaeological, it would have made it a stronger case. That's right. Good point. Yes.
I had a question about. I didn't, from the images you showed, I didn't get a feeling that this is really spectacular. as a visual or emotional kind of a confrontation between the human and this natural wonder. Compared to Carlsbad Caverns or some of the other big caves in America, was the public response to it really, was it awesome, or was it just a slog down through a hole?
Oh no, it was spectacular. There were crystals in there, and there's one thing that I omitted because I was running out of time at the end. But there was a contractor that was allowed to bid on the project after Claude Brown had turned it back over to the City of Cody. And it's a really unfortunate 2-year period because that contractor and his partner was seen soon after taking out the contract of taking trucks up to the cavern, and people in Cody said, "Oh, look at all the stuff he's hauling in there." And they're hauling up stuff to rebuild the inside. Boy, that's great. They weren't doing that at all. They were taking the trucks up there and they were loading the trucks up with crystals that they had chipped off, and stalactites and all of those things, and had been chipping it off and hauling it away and selling it. And it was exactly the kind of thing that Theodore Roosevelt had contemplated with the creation of the Antiquities Act. It's a question over there. Excuse me? They were not aware of it. The city wasn't aware of it. It was still under city control at that time.
Do you have any photographs of what it looked like before that happened?
Actually, a lot of these pictures show the front part of the cavern. The real problem is that lighting was such an issue, and color photography was in its infancy when this was a really spectacular site. So there have been some interiors shot. There were some great interiors shot, and even exterior pictures shot for Wyophile several years ago by Dewey Vanderhoff, who did a wonderful job showing what still was there in terms of the beautiful formations and the spectacular colors. And so those are great, but amateur photographers couldn't make it work to make it look like anything except, oh gee, there's a flash in a dark room. So I didn't bring any of mine.
Okay, very much so.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.